I'm Pat Brown, the founder of Impossible Foods and a professor at Stanford University, among many other things. Give him a round of applause. Pat, my friend, one of the things I enjoyed most about this movie, especially at the very beginning, is how many hairstyles you had. Like, it kept changing. I loved it. There's no response to that. I'm sorry.
Well, my stylist is my daughter, and basically I get a haircut whenever she decides it's too long and too unruly. So it fluctuates a lot.
I loved it. Jared, my friend, can I turn to you? This film is great. There's so much richness in it. What was the inspiration for you behind it?
There were a lot of inspirations. It's part of a series we have called Wild Hope, which is designed to go out and find whatever else is going on in the world. We wanted to find people who were making a difference in conservation and in ways that is inspiring people wherever they are, that there are things you can do to take action. Yeah. So the series, we're 3 seasons into our Wild Hope series, but when we saw this story, it was it epitomized so much of what we were trying to do. It was a person who was not going to wait around for someone else to solve the problem. It was a person who was recognizing an important problem and that he had the solutions to solve it. And it was just an incredible journey, being able to follow the story all the way through to see how Pat landed up where he ended up with this. Yeah. So it just had all the elements. We're a nonprofit production company whose mission is to tell stories about science, to help educate, help inspire people to recognize what science can do. And this story had that in spades as well, because it shows the underlying science that was required to make these changes. And so it had all the elements, it had a great character, and we sort of knew that it would appeal to audiences on a bunch of different levels.
Yeah, and I love that, you do take the viewer on a journey. This is an actual journey of what inspired Pat. How do you reconcile that with what's going on in the world right now, telling these stories of hope in sometimes an unhopeful world?
I would say it's even more important now. Yes, and sometimes, quite often, a very unhopeful world. But despite that, there are people. We've by the end of next year, we'll have, I think, 45 Wild Hope episodes.
Oh, nice.
Every single one of them is about hope. Is about people who aren't saying I have no hope, but who are getting up in the morning and making a difference. And sometimes it's very local, sometimes it's very much about what can I do in my community, and other times it's about how can I do things big like this and actually change the world. So I think more than ever, we need that hope. We need to be able to get up in the morning and say, hey, there are people who are making a difference, there is still change we can make. So that's the goal of the series, and I think it's as important now as it ever was.
Film is so important for that inspiration, and thank you for doing these films. It's really important. Please give Jared a round of applause for being such a great inspiration. Pat, for me, there's a very personal moment in the film where we hear about the guidance your parents gave you to pursue what's meaningful. My parents gave me that same kind of advice, and it chokes me up a little, right? Because that really shaped who you are and shaped your career.
Yeah, it was always expected in my family that, what we would be choosing to do was basically to try to make the world better.
Right.
And it was never even it wasn't particularly discussed. It was just sort of understood. And, what could be more rewarding and fun than to make that, the goal of your life.
Can you talk about the fun aspect? I think we forget that scientists can be really fun because it's such a deeply, you have to have deep knowledge of your subject matter, but you are clearly a person who has a lot of fun doing it.
Oh yeah, one of the things that I believe about science, and I just believe about basically life in general, is that the magic ingredient for creativity is fun. And, at Impossible Foods, well, also in my lab at Stanford, it's really important to have kind of a loose, sort of fun environment and to make sure that, what we're doing is stuff that that we love, that we're having fun doing,
Yeah.
and that we have colleagues that are fun to work with and so
Right.
forth. But yeah, I think that's you basically almost can't be creative if you're not having fun.
Right. And that creativity, for both of you, that creativity comes from curiosity. So, Jared, you have a deep curiosity about the world around you. I've had many conversations with you, and that translates into these films, but your whole staff has that deep level of curiosity as well.
Yeah, I think you need that to want to tell these stories. I was someone who, growing up, I was interested in science, but I didn't pursue that as a career. I fell in love with it when we started telling stories about it, because I think that's when all the pieces come together, and the challenge of figuring out how do you make something interesting to a general audience who maybe think they're interested in science, maybe don't, but how do you sort of apply that? How do you find the path through? And I know Pat and I had a conversation at an earlier screening about how much of the story was about Pat versus how much of it was about the work that Pat did. And for me, when you get it right, you find that perfect balance where I know for me, every time I watch this film, I've seen it a lot now, but every time I watch it, I'm so intrigued by Pat the person, Pat the scientist, and the work that Pat does. And when you can blend those together, then it's a lot more compelling than an educational piece that is just going to teach you something.
Right.
You can teach a lot if you tell a good story. And so that's where the fun part of my business is the creativity of how do you put that together in a way that will engage an audience and keep them there and watching and learning.
Absolutely. Pat, when you first started being an academic, a scientist, did you think about the storytelling and communication side of this work and getting it to an audience like this?
Not really.
Yeah.
No, I mean, I'm not naturally an extrovert and not a public communications person, but so for me it was all about doing the work that I was capable of doing and trying to have an impact there, yeah, it would speak for itself.
Yeah, I kind of respectfully disagree. I've been on many panels with you for several years now. You're a good storyteller. You've learned how to do this in a really creative way. But, I also know you as somebody who is not a pessimist, but you see the problems in the world. And I wonder how you remain hopeful. And do you think we'll reach a point that eaters, consumers, will understand that their food choices have a real impact, not just on, planetary health, but human health?
Yeah, I think that will happen. I think the way I approached the problem was start out with basically the belief that you're not going to solve it by cajoling or educating or coercing or trying to get people to change parts of their behavior or to reduce or eliminate something that gives them a lot of pleasure.
Sure.
I think that education will happen, but what we had to do was to accept the fact that people are going to continue to love meat and milk and dairy foods and fish and all the foods we use animals to make today, and recognize that the real problem isn't that people love those foods. The problem is that we're using the wrong technology to produce them. Mm-hmm. And in the food system, animals are just a technology. They're used as a technology to turn plants into meat and milk and eggs and fish, for that matter. And when you think about it that way, it's clear that there has to be better technology for doing this. A better way, by technology, it's just a tool we use to accomplish something of value. And people, thousands of years ago, realized that domesticating animals could save them a lot of labor and energy and produce, an accessible source of food that they couldn't have otherwise. And there was really no better way to do it. And at that time, of course, the population was a lot smaller, and the amount of land globally that was required to do all that was not extremely impactful. Well, now, as was pointed out in the film, we're using 45% of the ice-free surface of Earth, raising animals on land for food. And as a result of that, the average populations of the terrestrial mammals, birds, reptiles, and amphibians are less than a third, and fish for that matter, are less than a third of what they were just 50 years ago. And that is a catastrophe, okay? And it's not stopping. It's that population collapse isn't stopping. And the thing to realize is that, it's not just, those animals are cool and, it'd be sad if there were no giraffes in the world and so forth. No, it's a much bigger issue than that because they're integral parts of the ecosystems that keep our planet viable. In fact, and by the way, it's not just vertebrates. The populations of flying insects worldwide are probably dropping at least as fast. They haven't been as well tracked, but all the evidence suggests that they're also less than a third of what they were 50 years ago. And I think something a lot of people don't realize is that insects, flying insects and birds, and the animals that disperse the seeds are essential parts of the reproductive system of plants. You can think of them, they're literally like the sex organs of plants in a way.
Yeah.
And when those populations are collapsing, that is just basically the first domino. That's the first sign of a much larger scale ecosystem collapse. And again, the thing to emphasize over and over again, overwhelmingly, it's due to our use of animals as food technology, which is incredibly inefficient, completely unnecessary from a food security standpoint, from a nutrition standpoint. We do it just because of the extra pleasure that people get from those foods. So that's really why the way I figured is if you can do a better job of delivering that pleasure, the nutritional qualities that people value from these foods, and make them more affordable. You don't have to educate great to educate people, but you don't have to persuade them. They'll just make a choice. They'll choose the food that does the best job of delivering what they care about.
Sure.
And nobody likes the fact that their meat comes from a slaughtered animal, okay? Doesn't matter how much they love meat. That's just, they accept that as a necessary price to pay for the foods they love. But if you could make the same foods without using animals as a technology, a lot of people say, oh, no, no one will want to buy them. Yes, they will. If they're more delicious, more nutritious, and cheaper, people will buy them.
Right. I'm going to interrupt you there. I think you're very good at sort of highlighting what we'll lose from this industrial animal agriculture system, biodiversity, all of the things that really keep Earth going. But there's also the sort of the flip side of that. Many meat eaters, we're in Texas, feel like they're going to be deprived of something. And I think that's a challenge we face in sort of the food movement. We're telling people that they're going to be deprived of something rather than what they'll gain. How do we switch that conversation?
Well, I think basically, rather than making it a conversation, the onus is on us. Those of us who are working to eliminate our dependence on animals in the food system, to create foods that deliver everything those meat eaters want. And, we've made huge progress at Impossible Foods. There's still a long way to go. But I think the critical thing that we've proven at this point is that it's doable, that we can actually we have beef, pork, and chicken products that in blind taste tests are preferred over the animal versions, okay, by meat eaters, by mainstream meat eaters. So it's doable.
Yeah.
And I think that's what we need to do so that nobody has to give up anything. If you say, you have to give up something you love, forget about it.
Yeah.
You're not going to win.
Right. Is the change for you from what you're seeing with your work happening quickly enough?
Well, not as quickly as I would like, absolutely not. But, my feeling is it'll take whatever time it takes, and our job is to make it happen as fast as possible.
Yeah.
Yeah.
While we're seeing this sort of push and urge to limit meat consumption and other animal products.
Not meat consumption, to limit the use of animals as the technology to produce the meat. Keep eating the meat, just don't use animals to produce it.
I'm going to continue on. We're also seeing interest in a sort of a move away from ultra-processed foods. So I'm wondering how you, as someone who created this Impossible Burger, sort of are able to think about this problem. You know, we don't want ultra-processed foods either. We want foods that are healthy for people and the environment.
Sure. Okay, that's an excellent question. So first of all, I would say at this point, most of the serious nutrition scientists in the world are realizing that ultra-processed is a stupid category. Okay. In fact, there have been a number of papers published in the last year or so, and more are going to be coming out from, I would say, the most authoritative sources that the foods that are classified as ultra-processed, there are only 3 categories of those foods that are associated with all the negative impacts that are attributed to this broad, uselessly broad category. Sweetened drinks, sweetened, basically breakfast cereals and things like that, and ready-to-eat meat and dairy products, okay? Like, processed meats and so forth. Everything else, if you look at everything else that gets binned in that category, there's zero association with any negative health consequences. And there have been you should check I'll send you the links. But this is.
I got the links.
So ultra-processed it's kind of like saying, well, brown animals are dangerous or something like that. It's a meaningless category with respect to the health consequences.
Sure,
what matters is the nutritional properties and, high glycemic index, high saturated fat.
Yep. I would just say, Pat, that it might be a meaningless category to scientists and nutritionists, but it's not a meaningless category to big food right now. And I think that's what we're up against. And so how do we reconcile? There are a lot of alternative meat products out there that folks like Marion Nestle, a famous nutritionist, consider ultra-processed. And I would just wonder what your thoughts are on that.
Well, I should have a talk with her, but basically I suspect that if you were to ask her, okay, what are the foods that get binned into this broad category? Which are the ones that are actually the bad guys? Okay, she would agree with what I just said. It's basically things that are sweetened foods and basically processed meat and ready-to-eat dairy products, and because that's what all the evidence says. So I think what's going to happen is, eventually the truth wins out. Okay. There are periods of time, we're in one right now, where, bullshit is dominating, but eventually the truth wins out, and I think the dust will settle on this issue.
Yeah,
but it's a problem in the meantime.
Yeah, and I'm very sort of optimistic because Gen Z and young folks have a very big bullshit detector, so they're not going to buy into that. I want to move on to, something you said in the film is that you're always thinking about the future. And we've been hearing about this work that you're doing to transform farmland and steward it in a really creative way. Can you talk a little bit more about what we saw in the film?
Yeah. So, from the start, my goal, just to be as direct as possible about it, is to completely eliminate the use of animals as a food technology because it's just irreducibly destructive. And But it's not enough to do that. Then we have to repair the damage that was done. And we don't want the people who are making a living, who are just doing a hard, dangerous job trying to support their families. They're not the bad guys at all. The slaughter cartel is the bad guys, but we don't want them to be collateral damage. And when you think about from a macroeconomic standpoint, I actually wrote an opinion piece for The Guardian about this, which I can send to you. But basically, the total income, like if you just focus on cattle farmers, the total global income from beef and dairy sales, the final product, is something like $800 billion, which is serious money, but a tiny fraction of that goes into the pockets of the farmers. Okay, so let's just say let's say $400 billion, okay? Well, that's a lot of money. But right now we're spending more than 10 times that much every year trying to replace fossil fuels with renewable energy. And projections of the economic impact of climate change basically are projecting that it's going to be upwards of $20 trillion a year. So if we could, if governments and other organizations would recognize that we can actually put the brakes on climate change, which you literally could. If you could phase out animal agriculture within a couple of decades, the negative emissions from that phase out, methane decay, nitrous oxide decay, and recovery, pulling carbon out of the atmosphere by biomass recovery, would offset all predicted ongoing emissions. For 30 years, we'd have a 30-year period of net zero, and it would offset more than 2/3 of predicted CO2 emissions through the end of the century. A huge impact on climate change. And given the economic impact of staying on our trajectory right now of climate change, it would be the best bargain ever to basically pay farmers and ranchers, not compel them, just offer them, okay? You want to keep chasing cows around, good, bless your heart. But but you can make more money by basically providing a public service, just like teachers provide a public service, firefighters provide a public service, restoring and preserving native ecosystems on the land that 10 years ago you were raising cattle on.
Sure.
I think that that may seem like a fantasy scenario, but from an macroeconomic standpoint, it's like a complete no-brainer. And what we need, though, is to provide them a playbook. And something that I think people aren't aware of is we don't understand how nature works, and we certainly don't understand how to restore a native ecosystem on land that's been degraded by animal agriculture. And that's why we're doing this experiment in Arkansas, because we're not pretending we know the answer, so we're trying a bunch of things.
Experimenting.
It's an experiment.
As a scientist does. And I agree that for farmers who want to get out of the vicious cycle of factory farming, and many of them do, many I know, they need a just transition. And this is one component of what a just transition could look like out of animal agriculture.
Yes, well, I think that it's more than that. There are farmers who are not looking for an alternative. I would say pretty much everybody in animal agriculture, the farmer side, are struggling, okay? It's just a very, very difficult, economically challenging business. And if someone were to say, you can stay on your land, you can keep your land, you can keep the tax advantages of having agricultural land, except that now you can earn a living by basically restoring a native ecosystem and providing this huge service to the world. Previously, you were providing food. Now you're basically stopping the greatest environmental threats the world has ever faced. And we don't need this for food anymore. It would be a voluntary thing.
Right, of
Not
course.
because people want to stop
Sure.
what they're doing, but because they see a better alternative.
Thank you. I want to end in these last few seconds with, a question for what's next for both of you. And Jared, I know you're constantly dreaming up film ideas. What's next?
I think even more so now, the challenge is to find those stories that really showcase the foundational science that underlies so many of the advances, so many of the things that are interesting and relevant to our lives. So, we're looking at health, we're looking at more wild hope. It's fertile ground. The stories are out there.
Literally.
People like Pat are out there. And so it's our job to find those stories and to find ways to make them relevant and make them realize. Again, with what I love so much about Pat's story is that he always seems to be one step ahead of where the problem is. He recognizes the problem, and he's already thinking, as he's inventing the burger, the meatless burger, he's already thinking about the carbon market.
Right.
And so, finding people who are thinking that far ahead and who are actually taking steps to get there, those are the stories that we want to tell.
Absolutely, and thank you for doing it. Pat, in about 30 seconds, what's next for you?
I'll say what I'm working on right at the moment. I've reactivated my lab at Stanford. I am right now, one of the projects I'm working on is developing, I think, what will be a major source of protein in the human diet in the future, which is the protein isolate from leaves. Because in order to make foods that consumers love, that can compete against animal-derived products, you need a protein source that's ideally flavorless, colorless, extremely water-soluble, things that don't apply to the existing plant proteins on the market. And it turns out that most of the protein on Earth is in leaves. Most of the protein in the diets of most animals on Earth comes from leaves, like elephants. That's where they get all their protein. And it's just never been developed as a protein source, but the protein from leaves is incredible from a nutritional standpoint. It's extremely water soluble. You can make a clear liquid solution of this protein that has 4 times the protein concentration of milk. That's basically a clear liquid. And so it's never been developed because basically leaves decay when you store them, whereas seeds don't. But that's not a problem anymore. So I'm trying to develop a scalable system. It has huge benefits for food security because you don't have to depend on just a few crops because every plant has leaves, basically. And the protein from grass is pretty much the same as the protein from oak leaves. And so anyway, it's another project. And then I'm continuing the Carbon Ranch project, and I'm looking to expand that to some other locations. Next, possibly California and Madagascar.
Oh, very cool. I'll be interested to hear more about those. Such exciting work. Thank you both. Great. Congratulations on the film. It was great. Thank you both so much. Give them a round of applause. Yes. We're going to take a short break in our panels for now so you can all get a bite to eat. You can find a full menu in your program, but I want to thank a few of our partners, including Impossible, Farmer's Fridge, Certified Origins, Atlantic Sea Farms, Little Sesame, Yolele, Spirit Almond, Sprouts Market, Hasta la Luna, 504, Inland Seafood, Aquanaria, Swig Cheese House, and Saggiano. Please make sure to come right back to your seats because we have another special musical performance from our singer-songwriter, Kelsey Creek. And our next panel will start exactly at 2:10 p.m., so I'll see you all then. Eat your Impossible Burgers and have a good time.